The evening was alive with the soft hum of conversations, the gentle clinking of silverware, and the warm glow of chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. The restaurant, La Maison Royale, was one of the most expensive in New York City. Only the wealthiest and most influential people dined there, enjoying five-star meals prepared by world-famous chefs. Martin Caldwell stepped inside, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit. His expensive cologne filled the air as he walked past the tables, barely glancing at the people around him. Martin was a self-made millionaire, proud of his success, and even prouder of the way people treated him because of it. He loved the power his money gave him. Wherever he went, people greeted him with smiles, not because they liked him, but because they feared losing his business. And Martin enjoyed that. Tonight was an important night. He had a meeting with a potential client, a deal that could double his wealth. Everything had to be perfect. He walked toward his reserved table, where his assistant had already placed his favorite wine. The best seat, the best service, nothing less than perfection. As he sat down, Martin scanned the restaurant, his sharp eyes observing the waiters moving between tables. He had always believed that rich people deserved respect, while those who worked in service jobs were beneath him. He never saw them as real people, only as faces that appeared when he needed something. A young waiter, Jamal Thompson, approached Martin's table with a polite smile. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and black vest, Jamal held a small notepad and pen, ready to take the order. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to La Maison Royale. May I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" Martin barely looked at him. Instead, he picked up the menu and sighed loudly, acting as if talking to the waiter was a waste of his time. He slowly flipped through the pages, his fingers tapping on the table impatiently. "You should already know what I want," he muttered. Jamal, still keeping his polite smile, responded, "Of course, sir. Would you like your usual order, or would you like to try our new chef's special?" Martin finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Do I look like I need your suggestions?" he said. His tone was cold, his words sharp. Other diners at nearby tables paused for a second, hearing his tone, but pretending not to notice. Jamal felt a slight discomfort but remained professional. He had worked in this restaurant long enough to know that some guests acted this way. He nodded, ready to take the order without further questions. But Martin wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming on his lips, ready to show his power. He had no idea that someone was watching him closely, someone who would soon turn the night into something he would never forget. Jamal stood patiently, waiting for Martin's order. He had been working at La Maison Royale for almost a year, and during that time, he had met all kinds of customers, some kind and respectful, others impatient and demanding. But Martin Caldwell was different. From the moment he walked in, it was clear that he thought he was better than everyone else. Martin finally put the menu down, sighing as if even ordering food was too much effort. "I'll take the filet mignon, medium rare. And make sure it's perfect. I don't want some dry, overcooked nonsense," he said, waving his hand as if dismissing Jamal. Jamal nodded, writing down the order. "Of course, sir. Would you like any sides with that?" he asked politely. Martin's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do I look like someone who needs help choosing what to eat?" he said, his voice sharp. Jamal kept his smile, though inside, he felt the familiar sting of disrespect. "Not at all, sir," he replied smoothly. "I'll make sure the order is prepared just the way you like it." But Martin wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Jamal, as if studying him for the first time. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his tone suddenly curious, but not in a friendly way. Jamal hesitated for a brief second before answering. "Almost a year, sir." Martin smirked. "A year, huh? And you're still just a waiter?" He let out a short, dry chuckle. "I guess ambition isn't for everyone." The words hit hard, but Jamal remained calm. He had heard comments like this before. People who thought that serving food meant a person wasn't smart, hardworking, or capable of more. But Jamal knew the truth. He had big dreams, and this job was just a stepping stone. Still, he had learned that there was no point in arguing with people like Martin. Jamal simply nodded. "I enjoy my work, sir," he said, his voice steady. Martin laughed, shaking his head. "Enjoy? That's a new one. But hey, as long as you're happy serving people like me, who am I to judge?" He picked up his wine glass and took a slow sip, clearly pleased with himself. Jamal felt the eyes of some nearby guests on him. They had heard Martin's words, but as always, no one said anything. People rarely stood up to men like Martin, men with power, money, and influence. But what Martin didn't know was that someone had been watching him closely. At a table just a few feet away, an older man sat quietly, observing every word and action. His expression remained neutral, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. And in just a few moments, Martin Caldwell's world was about to change in a way he never expected. Jamal gave a small nod and turned to walk toward the kitchen, keeping his posture straight and professional. He had learned long ago not to let rude customers affect him. But as he stepped away, he could still feel Martin Caldwell's eyes on him, as if the rich man was amused by his own words. The restaurant continued to hum with soft conversations and the occasional sound of laughter. Waiters moved smoothly between tables, carrying trays of expensive dishes, their steps practiced and graceful. To anyone watching, it seemed like just another ordinary evening at La Maison Royale. But at one particular table, an older man sat in silence, observing everything with careful eyes. His presence was easy to overlook. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but there was something about him that commanded quiet respect. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and he wore a tailored navy blue suit. A gold watch rested on his wrist, though he never once glanced at it. Instead, his sharp eyes followed every move, every word that had just been spoken between Martin and Jamal. The man had arrived a little earlier that evening, greeted warmly by the restaurant's owner. He was a regular customer, though few people ever recognized him. He preferred it that way. Fame and recognition had never been his goal in life, but those who knew who he was understood the kind of power he held. From his table, he had seen everything. The way Martin barely acknowledged Jamal, the way he spoke with cold amusement, the way he laughed at someone simply for doing their job. The older man's expression remained calm, but a thoughtful look crossed his face. Meanwhile, Martin was enjoying himself. He swirled his wine glass lazily, leaning back in his chair, completely unaware of the man sitting behind him. He had no regrets about how he spoke to the waiter. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. If anything, he believed he had simply spoken the truth. People in high places deserved respect. Those who worked in service were just there. They existed to take orders, to bring food, to clean up afterward. That was their job, and Martin didn't see why he should treat them as equals. He took another sip of wine, glancing at his expensive watch. His client would be arriving soon, and once they signed the deal, he would be one step closer to another big payday. His thoughts were only on business, on money, on power. He had no idea that, in just a few moments, his entire evening was about to take an unexpected turn. The older man behind him finally set down his glass of water and leaned slightly forward, as if making a decision. He had seen enough, and Martin Caldwell was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Martin tapped his fingers on the table, glancing around the restaurant. He was growing impatient. His client was running late, and waiting was not something he enjoyed. He hated wasting time, especially in a place like this. He picked up his wine glass again, but before he could take another sip, he noticed something unusual. The restaurant owner, Mr. Anderson, was walking toward a table near him with a nervous expression. Martin had known Mr. Anderson for years, and he had never seen the man look so uneasy. Curious, Martin turned slightly in his chair to see who the owner was speaking to. That was when he noticed the older man sitting at the table behind him. He had been there the whole time, but Martin hadn't paid him any attention. Until now. Mr. Anderson leaned in and spoke softly to the man. Though Martin couldn't hear the exact words, he could tell it was something important. The restaurant owner stood with his hands clasped, nodding respectfully as the older man gave a small response. Martin raised an eyebrow. Who was this man? It was clear that he wasn't just an ordinary customer. Even the waiters seemed more alert around him, making sure everything at his table was perfect. As Martin watched, the older man slowly stood up. He was tall, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He adjusted the sleeve of his suit and then, to Martin's surprise, he started walking directly toward him. Martin quickly turned back, pretending not to notice, but he felt a sudden tension in the air. A few moments later, the man stopped beside his table. Martin looked up, and for the first time, he saw the man's face clearly. Something about him seemed familiar. His deep brown eyes held quiet authority, and there was a calmness about him that made it impossible to ignore him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't smiling, he was simply watching. Martin cleared his throat, feeling strangely uncomfortable. "Can I help you?" he asked, forcing a polite smile. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced briefly at the kitchen, where Jamal had disappeared to place the order. Then he looked back at Martin and spoke in a slow, steady voice. "I couldn't help but notice how you spoke to that young man just now." Martin's smile faded slightly. "And?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent. The older man studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something to himself. "I believe we should have a conversation," he said. Martin frowned. "About what?" The man's eyes didn't waver. "Respect." The word hung in the air between them, making Martin shift in his chair. He had spent his whole life in control, always the most important person in the room. But for some reason, right now, he didn't feel as powerful as he usually did. And deep down, he had a strange feeling that this conversation was about to change everything. Martin shifted in his chair, feeling a sudden wave of discomfort. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he didn't even know. He straightened his posture, trying to regain control of the situation. "Respect," Martin repeated, letting out a small chuckle. "I treat people the way they deserve to be treated." The older man didn't react. He simply pulled out a chair and sat down across from Martin, his expression calm but firm. The restaurant had grown quieter, as if people could sense something important was happening. A few waiters slowed their steps, sneaking glances at the scene unfolding before them. "I believe you've misunderstood something," the man said. His voice was steady, not loud, but there was something about it that made Martin listen. "Respect is not given based on wealth or status. It's about character." Martin scoffed, shaking his head. "Look, I don't know who you are, but I don't need a lecture on character. I've built my success from nothing. I've earned the right to sit here and expect good service." The man nodded slightly, as if he had expected this response. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "And do you believe that gives you the right to look down on others?" Martin's jaw tightened. He was beginning to feel trapped, like he was being put on trial in his own territory. "Listen," Martin said, lowering his voice. "I don't have time for this. I have a meeting in a few minutes and—" The older man interrupted, his voice still calm but firm. "Your meeting is with me." For a second, Martin thought he had misheard. He blinked, his mind scrambling to process the words. "What?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. He placed it gently on the table and slid it toward Martin. Hesitant, Martin picked it up and read the name. Harold Livingston. The name hit him like a shockwave. Harold Livingston, the billionaire investor. The man Martin had been desperate to impress, the very person he had been waiting for. Martin's face paled. He had expected his client to be some ordinary businessman, but Harold Livingston was far from ordinary. He was one of the most respected figures in the industry, a man known for his wisdom and fairness. If there was anyone Martin needed on his side, it was him. For the first time that evening, Martin found himself at a loss for words. His arrogance, his confidence, it all seemed to shrink under Harold's steady gaze. Harold leaned back in his chair, giving Martin a moment to process the situation. Then he spoke again, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. "Now," he said, "let's talk about what kind of man you really are." Martin swallowed hard, realizing that this was no longer just a business meeting. This was a lesson, and he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Martin stared at the business card in his hand, his fingers gripping it tightly. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the situation sank in. Harold Livingston, the very man he had been eager to impress, the man who could take his business to the next level, was sitting right in front of him. And he had just humiliated a waiter in front of him. For the first time in a long time, Martin didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel in control. He felt exposed. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile, trying to regain some of his confidence. "Mr. Livingston, I had no idea it was you." Harold didn't react to Martin's sudden change in tone. He simply leaned forward, his sharp eyes never leaving Martin's face. "Would it have made a difference?" he asked. Martin blinked. "What do you mean?" Harold tilted his head slightly. "If you had known who I was, would you have treated that young man differently?" Martin opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know how to answer. Harold continued, his voice steady. "You see, Martin, I've built my success on one simple principle: respect. Not just for business partners, not just for powerful men in suits, but for everyone." Martin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't like where this conversation was going. He wanted to talk about deals and numbers, not about morals and respect. Harold let out a small sigh and glanced toward the kitchen. "That young man you humiliated, his name is Jamal Thompson. He's not just a waiter. He's a hard-working individual with dreams, just like you once were. And just because he's serving food today doesn't mean he'll be in that position forever." Martin swallowed hard, feeling guilt creep in. He had never stopped to think about Jamal as a person with hopes, goals, and ambitions. To him, Jamal had just been another face, another worker in the background. Harold's voice softened, but it still held its firm authority. "You remind me of someone I once knew, Martin. A man who thought power and money made him better than others. He believed success gave him the right to treat people however he pleased." Martin frowned. "What happened to him?" Harold's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "He lost everything." The words hit Martin harder than he expected. He felt his stomach tighten as he realized Harold wasn't just telling a story. He was warning him. Harold folded his hands on the table. "I don't invest in businesses, Martin. I invest in people. And character matters to me just as much as numbers do." He paused before adding, "Tell me, why should I invest in someone who lacks respect for others?" Martin felt his throat go dry. He had spent his entire career convincing people to work with him. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he had an answer. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid of losing something money couldn't buy. Martin felt a strange tightness in his chest. He was used to being in control of conversations, of negotiations. But this wasn't a business deal anymore. This was something deeper, something personal. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what to say. Harold sat calmly across from him, waiting. His expression wasn't angry, but it was firm. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to teach a lesson. Martin cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "Mr. Livingston, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just..." Harold raised a hand slightly, stopping him. "You were just what?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "Just being careless with your words. Just acting as if someone's worth is measured by the job they do." Martin felt his face grow hot. He had spent years building a reputation as a successful businessman, a man people respected. But in this moment, sitting across from Harold, he felt small. "I didn't think about it that way," Martin admitted, lowering his gaze. Harold studied him for a moment before speaking again. That's the problem, Martin. People like you don't think about it. You speak without care, treat others without respect, and believe your success makes you better than them. He leaned back in his chair. But success means nothing if you lose your humanity along the way. Martin swallowed hard. Deep down, he knew Harold was right. He had spent so much time chasing money, power, and status that he had stopped seeing people as individuals. He had stopped remembering where he came from, how he had once been a struggling young man, desperate for a chance. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Jamal had disappeared earlier. He thought about the way he had spoken to him, the look on the young man's face as he tried to remain professional. It suddenly made Martin feel ashamed. Harold's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Tell me something, Martin. If someone had treated you that way when you were starting out, how would you have felt? Martin hesitated. He didn't have to think hard about the answer. He knew how he would have felt. Angry, hurt, humiliated, just like Jamal probably felt now. For the first time in a long time, Martin didn't have a clever response. He didn't have an excuse. He simply let out a slow breath and nodded. You're right, he admitted quietly. I was wrong. Harold didn't smile or nod in approval. He simply studied Martin for a moment, as if measuring the honesty in his words. Then what are you going to do about it? He asked. Martin looked toward the kitchen again, feeling something unfamiliar, a deep, genuine need to make things right. And for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he needed to do.